It's my great pleasure to introduce you to this special sample lecture, which I hope will give you an idea of how we teach at ESCP Europe and also the kind of content that you can expect. The title of today's sample lecture is an introduction to cross-cultural business. And doing so, I am going to take you to two main questions during today's sample lecture. The first one is a very important one. It is about cultural differences. What are cultural differences and where do they come from? And you'll see that a lot of the time, the knowledge that we use is actually borrowed from disciplines that are not just business, but that go beyond. For instance, in my case, psychology, because I am a psychologist. The second question I will be asking that is a consequence of the first one is how do these cultural differences affect the way we do business across culture? And doing so, there will be two different times in this lecture. The first one will be to help you. My objective will be to help you to understand what culture is and why it matters. And the second one, I will show you how and why it matters for business. Let's start with defining culture and understanding how culture works. And I'll give you a psychological perspective doing so. So what is culture from a psychological perspective? For most of us, culture really is about countries. When we think about cultures, we think about different countries. And often, in other words, that's kind of down to how we do things here. You know, in my country, we do things in a different way. But perhaps in your country, because you just moved to ESCP Europe, you're a new student, you're going to tell me all about how you do things in your home culture. Well, psychologists like to put a bit of theory behind that. And I'm going now to tell you how psychologists define culture. When psychologists look at culture, they define it as shared elements that provide standards for perceiving, believing, evaluating, communicating, and acting among those who share a language, historical period, and geographical location. Now, let me try to explain you and go beyond that definition. So the first important thing in that definition is that culture is about shared elements. In other words, if you have a culture, it needs to be a culture that is in common with other people. That's the first important thing about culture, is that culture is not something that is unique to you, but it's something that is shared with other people. The second thing that is important about our definition of culture is that our definition of culture is all about providing standards. In other words, why culture matters? It matters because it helps you to behave in an environment that is new to you. If you share the same culture, you're going to be able to know how to behave in an unknown context. And these standards, so these ways of behaving, can be specific to how we perceive the environment around us, more on this later, the things that we believe as true or not true, how we evaluate things around us, how we think a product is a good one, is not a good one, how we like movies and so on, the way we communicate with the world. And again, more about this in a few minutes in the second part of our lecture. And all of these are affecting how all of this is affecting how we behave, but most importantly, we share it with the people. So people around us might be the people we share language with. That's one of the first things that is important about culture. It can also be the people that we share a historical period of time with, that we've experienced things and lived things together with, or people that are from the same geographical location. It doesn't have to be, and that's an important point I wanted to make early on, these guides our behavior. So if we decide to not behave according to cultural prescriptions, then often we tend to be excluded. But we don't and shouldn't think of culture as something that is just at a national level. Culture is something that can be at a national level, of course. That's what we tend to call macro cultures, that is cultures that are among large sizes of populations or large countries, for instance, or geographical areas. But culture can also be what we would call a microculture. For instance, think about your high school. Maybe in your former high school or in your current high school, you were experiencing a way of doing things, a way of being taught, a way of acting among your peers that was different from a high school you used to study at before. And that would be an example of different microcultures. The same go when you go and work in the industry. The same is true for the companies that you might work for. If you, for instance, think about working for a bank, you usually go for your first day at job and every subsequent day, very nicely dressed, wearing a suit, wearing a tie. And that's a kind of like the banking corporate culture, as we would say. So that's an example of a microculture. But if you decide to work, let's say, for a startup company, your CEO might be just a few years older than you, and you might find that that CEO is wearing a sweatshirt. And that's a kind of different microculture that you are experiencing doing that. Where do these differences come from? That's a fascinating question for psychologists. Part of the answer comes from when we're kids, when we're very young. And look at this kid on the picture. He doesn't seem very convinced that what's in the plate is good for him. Now, think about the country and the culture that you're from. And think about maybe as a kid what you would be told if you would not eat what's in your plate. Well, in some parts of the world, you might be told things such as, eat what's in your plate and you'll grow stronger. You'll become a taller boy, a taller girl, you'll be better at sport, you'll beat others and so on. Or maybe what you were told were things such as, think about how lucky you are to be different from those that do not have food in their plate and do not have enough food to eat. Or maybe you were told things such as, think about the farmer who works so hard to be able to harvest this, what's in your plate. Think about how upset the farmer would be if he would see that you're not eating what's in the plate. All these little sentences that I've just told you illustrates some of the cultural differences that you inculcate to kids at a very early age onwards. And this, according to psychologists, leads to what we call differences in self-perception. And to be even more precise, we call these differences in self-perception self-construal. How we construe ourselves, how we represent ourselves, how we represent others, and how we represent the overlap between ourselves and others. Let's have a look at what's at the board right now. On the left-hand side, we've got what we call an independent self. So that is someone that think about themselves, think about others, but there is no real overlap between the two. Their representation of the self is very unique, that's me and not someone else. And the representation of people that are close to them, like their fathers, their siblings, their close friend, is again something that is separate from the self. In other words, these people here that have an independent self think of themselves as different from others. And it's not the case from all the people that have what you see on the right-hand side, more of what we call in research an interdependent self. An interdependent self is all about overlaps of representation. In other words, when I think of myself, I think about others that are close to me. I think about my father, I think about the things I share with him, maybe a passion for the same football team, for instance. All of these tend to be quite important and they guide a lot of things. They guide the way we memorize information. They guide the way we see, for instance, others around us and in terms of similarities and differences with us. And to illustrate that further, I want to share with you some fascinating research conducted about 20 years ago where researchers asked students one very simple question is, who are you? And students had to answer the question, I am. And what researchers noted is that people that come from more of a Western background tended to adopt very absolute and abstract answers. So an example of someone coming from a Western country would be someone from the United States of America or the United Kingdom. And these tended to use abstract and absolute answers such as, I'm shy, I am a student. So one adjective, one qualification that doesn't involve a specific context. It's very personal and very absolute. On the other end, respondents that were coming from more Eastern countries, example of Eastern countries can be, for instance, China, Japan, tended to describe themselves in terms of context and relationships. So when asking who are you to participants in this study in China or Japan, you would get answers such as, I'm the son of a banker, I am shy at school. Here, you can see the difference between the two answers. They are context dependent because we're talking about being shy at school. We're not talking about being shy, generally speaking, in all possible contexts. We're talking about being shy in one specific context. Another example that shows you a difference is in this one, as someone might say, I am the son of a banker. Here, you're putting an emphasis, a relationship between yourself and other self. That's exactly what I was showing you on the previous slide when I was showing you these overlaps. We are typically in what we call the interdependent self when you say, for instance, I am the son of a banker, because what you're putting the emphasis on is the connection between yourself and someone from another culture. Another way of thinking about culture and why it matters before moving on to business-related examples is to think about what we aspire to be. In other words, what are the ideals that we see as important? And here, just to illustrate two quite contrasting examples of ideas. In Japan, you often frame who you aspire to be in terms of hitonami, which is or means average as a person, or rashihi, which means similar to the typical person that fulfills a role in society. So you might want to be a typical banker. You might want to be a typical journalist. You want to be the same as the average person in society. Now, maybe you're saying this is not really what where I come from, the ideal is. You might think that where you come from, the ideal is more similar to what we would call an individualist ideal. That's, for instance, what you see in the United States of America, where ideals are often framed in terms of uniqueness, in terms of being different from others, and in terms of standing out. And that's why you often have something that we call the false uniqueness effect, which is that people have the impression that they're different from others. If you ask people how similar you think others, or how similar they think others are to them, they're going to say that others are different from them and they are different from others. When if you ask the same question in a more collectivist, in that kind of example of my Japanese example, you will find that people relate and call for much more similarities between the two. Now, here is a question for you. Can you already start and think about how this might affect how you maybe want to market a product, maybe how you want to sell a product? If you've got someone that wants to be similar to others, would you sell the product the same way compared to someone that actually wants to be unique and different? The answer is probably you would do it differently. And I will tell you in a few minutes some examples of how you could do it. But a key question before we move to these further examples about how and why culture matters for business is, can I change my cultural mindset? Let's say that at the age of 6, you were invited to travel with your parents and you went to another country. Is this something that is likely to affect how you see yourself? And if not just visiting a country, but if you were to move completely to a different country, would this also affect how you see yourself and how you relate in terms of the cultural environment and the cultural background that you're from? Well, that's a question that we've asked ourselves as psychologists, and the Japanese psychologist Minura is one that provided a lot of interesting answers. Minura was studying Japanese childhood immigrants that left Japan to move to the United States of America. And as we've just discussed, in Japan, you've got an ideal self that is more of an interdependent one. And in the US, it's more of an independent one. In the Japanese ideal, you want to be similar to others. In the American ideal, you want to be different from others. Well, Minura's question was, how does it matter? And the answer that Minura brought was that the key factor is not how long you've spent in the US, in terms of whether it changes or not who you are. But the key question or the key factor is when you moved to the US. And to be more specific, what Minura found was that if you move at the age of 9 or younger, you tend to adopt a new independent mindset, much more of an American mindset. If you move around the age of 10 or 11, you're less likely to switch completely, and you're more likely to retain what we'd call a mixed approach. So part of yourself will be unique and different. Part of yourself will be about similarities you have and connections with others. And then, so that's what we call the bicultural approach. And then if you move at 12 years or over, you're more likely to retain your home culture. That is, you're more likely to retain that predominant interdependent mindset where belonging and feeling similar to others is what matter. Now, this leads us to important points as well. There are some factors that can influence acculturation. That is, when we move to another culture, what happens to our original cultural values and how we perceive ourselves in relation to our original culture. For instance, the extent to which we were interacting with other kids. So if you are an immigrant from a country and you get to be socialized with a lot of people from your home culture, your new home culture, then that will make you more likely to switch to another mindset. Another example in Minura studies is that if at home you're using the English language, both at home and outside of home, you are much more likely to actually switch your mindset and as a consequence become more independent. On the other end, if you stick to your home language when you're at home, this is more likely to still make you maintain an identity and a perception of culture that is much closer to your home culture. That is, in the case of Minora, much closer to Japan and the idea of being similar to others. Now, this was an introduction to what psychologists call culture and the consequences it has on self-perception. I've invited you during this first part to kind of reflect on how and why it could matter when you want to do business. And I'm now going to discuss in more depth why it matters for business. Now, my field is applied psychology, and I applied all the psychological topics I've discussed so far to the field of marketing, advertising, and communication. One of the best ways to think about these differences in culture is to look at advertising and the way advertising is done. In marketing, if you think about a TV commercial or a movie commercial, there is one thing that is very important, and we call it the pack shot. That's when you see the packaging of a product and you've got usually a tagline that is something that talks about the brand. And I wanted to show you how these pack shots can be very different across cultures. For instance, if you take my example on the left, which is for a drink in the US, you can see that the pack shot is a very simple one. You have a product and you have a tagline, that is a sentence about the brand, but you do not have anything else in the background that would create distractions for the eyes of the viewer. If you look at a drink from Japan, you can see that you've got a standard drink here, but at the same time, you've got elements that move in the background. And that is a typical example of cultural differences in advertising. Now, you might ask, where do these differences actually come from? Well, they come from the fact that we don't see the world the same way. Research by Nisbet and Miyamoto looked at how we see portraits. And what they showed is that a portrait from someone that comes from a more Western cultural environment is mainly the face. But a portrait for someone that comes from a more Eastern collectivist environment is something that takes into consideration everything from the face to the entire body to the background that goes with it. And these are differences in what we call information processing style. In other words, how we process information, how we look at pictures, how we look at elements of the pictures and our environment. If I go back to my example of the two drinks I was showing you, you can see that they reflect these differences. On the one hand, we've got the very simple product that is a bit equivalent to the face we were discussing earlier. On the other end, we've got a drink, but we also have a background story that is so important in cultures that are non-Western, such as more collectivist cultures, for instance. And there are many more differences that include cultural differences in advertising. Shavid and colleagues, for instance, looked at the messages that people in marketing put across cultures. And what Shavit and colleagues found is that in cultures that involve a lot of hierarchy, they're what we call in psychology vertical cultures, the message that is being put in ads is all about status. What are examples of status messages? Well, they can be references to luxury products. They can be scenarios in advertising in which it's a lot about impressing other people. They can be endorsement by high status people. These can be celebrities, for instance. Or they can be other forms of distinction, such as the mention award-winning for a product or for movies and so on. In cultures that are, on the contrary, non-hierarchical, we call them in psychology horizontal cultures. That means everyone is perceived as being equal in society. The message that predominates in advertising is all about pleasure. It's not about status, it's about enjoying the product, it's about enjoying the service. And last but not least, in cultures that are more about individualism, that is about being different from others, the message that tends to be portrayed is all about uniqueness. That is, what matters is about being different from others. And that can be by wearing a product that makes you look different. That can be by having a scenario in a commercial where you are the only one engaging in a behavior that shows how different and strong you feel about your opinions. And that's what matters in culture that put the emphasis on uniqueness. There's another way in which we play about cultural differences, and that's what we call in marketing the country of origin effect. What is the country of origin effect? The country of origin effect is the favorable or unfavorable evaluation of a country that tends to be associated with a brand and as a consequence tend to lead to favorable or unfavorable opinions about a product or a service. For instance, luxury companies tend to use made in Italy, made in France, made in the UK as a sign of a country of origin because it denotes quality for the people that buy the product. In the field of technology, Japan is often seen as having a positive country of origin effect. That is, if you have a product that is made in Japan, for consumers, it's seen as a sign of quality. However, in certain parts of the world, this will actually have a negative effect. And that's the case in certain parts of China, as the research done by Klein and colleagues in 1998 suggests, because there are parts of China that will view a Japanese product as something that is negative for historical reasons and historical tensions between the countries. Sometimes being a foreign brand can be an asset. Research in India, for instance, shows that Indian consumers tend to respond better to a foreign brand compared to a local brand. So there seems to be something about a brand that is from outside of your country that can be a positive sign and that can be valued by consumers. When it comes to doing international marketing, being culturally minded, understanding consumer differences, means that you understand that consumers in different countries might be using products in different ways. For instance, you might avoid making embarrassing mistakes. A famous car brand once used a name for a car that was an insult in another culture. And they didn't realize that because they did not take into consideration what the other culture was about and what meaning a product could have in another culture. You can also use your understanding of cultural differences to take advantage of cross-cultural opportunities. You might have spotted a product when you were traveling that you think is not offered where you're coming from, and that could actually do great. So maybe you're traveling to the US or maybe you're traveling to China and you will see that they have a specific device that is used, for instance, to carry a drink, and you see that it could be used in your home country, and therefore you can start an importing business using this understanding of cross-cultural differences. That's a very good question. It refers to also sometimes what we call glocalized marketing. So we have a global product with a global vision, but then we adapt it to a more local type of context. I would say, first of all, it's quite rare to have a product that purely fulfills the same function regardless of the culture. Let's take the example of high-end smartphones. Now, high-end smartphones are the same regardless of the country. You can buy the latest smartphone from all the big manufacturers. You can buy it in most countries and they will be the exact same product. But the meaning will not be the same. Owning the latest smartphone, let's say in a country that is a Western rich country, is not going to have the same meaning and not going to be seen as the same as buying the same product in a country maybe that is less developed economically or where the choice of the brand will stand out. And I could go even further and you say, for instance, if you buy a car, many countries, for instance, have car manufacturers from their country, and so displaying and buying a car from a different country, even though it stays the same product, the same car, it will have a different meaning, because if you buy a car from your country, you may express loyalty towards your country. If you buy a car from a different country, you may actually deviate from that cultural norm and express a desire to stand out. So regardless of the product category, it's quite difficult to find a product that is universal. And even though it might be the same product, what research suggests is that it can be quite dangerous to assume that it will work the same way. There will always be subtle things that you should look at. Even though you might think that, for instance, your product is great and should be sold the same way, you might still want to adapt the stories in the commercial so that the stories resonate to people. Just to give you an example, a lot of companies use sports in advertising, but the meaning of certain sports is very cultural. If you use what we call in Europe American football, it will resonate well with the US, maybe with some other parts of the world that follow American football, but it's not something that will necessarily resonate well with European consumers or with other parts of the world. Same for other sports like rugby that would have, again, a positive connotation in certain European countries and perhaps Australia and New Zealand, but not necessarily in the rest of the world. And the same goes with many other sports. So it's always important to ask yourself, what will make my product resonate at a very local level? Even though your product is the same, even though you feel that the need that your product is fulfilling is a universal need, the story will always be different, and the way you will craft that story to correspond to the local culture and the value will have to be different as well. The typical types of jobs that are related to these you can find in multiple industries. Traditionally, the marketing industry has a lot of roles and junior roles for which you will need some knowledge about psychology. If you want to work in market research, that's one of the keywords you might want to use. If you want to work in consumer insights, that's another one. You will need to rely on this type of information. Then there is the now quite established field of behavioral insights or behavioral psychology or behavioral economics. And a lot of small or larger consulting firms are opening up and require people that are capable of doing behavioral economics, behavioral analysis, which is psychology applied to making decisions or decision making. So these are also potential areas for students to look in terms of internships. Market research, the marketing companies that produce the products, and consulting companies that work around the field of behavioral science and behavioral change. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time today and for this lecture. Again, what we've been discussing throughout this lecture is the importance to understand what culture is about, where the differences are coming from, and what are some of the very important aspects of business that are impacting by culture. And the core message is that culture is something that goes way beyond something like national differences, that can be among different organizations, different schools, different universities, different groups of friends, and that all these macro elements of cultures can actually affect the behaviors that you have. If you've enjoyed this lecture, there'll be plenty of these topics that will be discussed on the Bachelor in Management at ESCP Europe, and we look forward to welcoming you on the program. Thank you very much for watching.